Welcome to Maldives Coral Institute's webinar. It's such a pleasure to be here, and a warm welcome to all of our panelists who are joining us from London, from York, from Mombasa in Kenya, and Gang in the Maldives as well. So I'm Zaheena Rasheed. I'm a journalist. I work with, I'm from the Maldives, and I'm in Male at the moment. I work for Al Jazeera's KL Bureau in Malaysia. I'll be moderating the panel today. And so just before I hand over to President Mohammed Nasheed, who is the former President Mohammed Nasheed, who is the chair of Maldives Coral Institute, I'll just give you a brief overview of the program. So we will first start with welcome remarks, and then we'll have presentations from Callum and Georgia, after which we will have a short break and then come back to the wider panel discussion with Kathryn and David and also Shaha. So yeah, to you, President Rasheed.
Thank you very much, Zaheena. Welcome everyone, welcome to this seminar by the Maldives Coral Institute. I'm very sorry we couldn't do it, hold it in person in the Maldives. We would have loved to do that. I'm sure we would be able to do another one fairly soon, and hopefully all of us together in the Maldives. But I am also pleased that so many of you have joined, logged in, signed up, and joined us online for this seminar, for this workshop. I would like to present, with us, we have Professor Callum Roberts. Professor Roberts is one of the best coral scientists around. He's from Australia, University of Exeter. But I don't think, University of Exeter in England, or no, it's Exeter in Australia.
It's in England.
It's Exeter in England. Who is, Professor Callum Roberts is our chief scientific advisor. We also have Georgia from the University of York joining us. And I would like to thank and welcome our expert panelists who will be responding to the findings of the research. They include Dr. Kathryn Mengerink. She is the executive director of the Wait Institute. And we have Shaha Hashim from the Blue Marine Foundation. Richard has just recently become the chair of the Blue Marine Foundation. He's a good man. And we also have Dr. David Obura from East Africa. Dr. David, you'll be shocked about of how much East African influence there is in the Maldives. Zaheena will be moderating this. Zaheena is our showpiece journalist of Maldives. She's our flagship journalist. She started working very young. She became very rapidly the best writer in the country with excellent prose and a very good eye and very disturbing attitude of questioning all the time. I do not suggest that you have a conversation or even a cup of tea with Zaheena. She would only be asking questions. She did later on an excellent TV documentary for Al Jazeera, Stealing Paradise, that highlighted extremely good work it was, that highlighted huge corruptions in the Maldives during the previous regime. Now today we have two pieces of research that would be presented to you. One is all the literature that is available on the reefs in the Maldives. Now this starts from the 1800s. And since 1800s, people have been actually doing scientific research on our coral, and therefore we have a fair amount of literature available. Now, there is another huge body of literature of Maldive reefs that is 1,000 years old. These are our land grants. that we call its copper plate grants. And on these copper plate grants, kings endow huge areas of coral reefs to different people. So basically, we have for 1,000 years, 1,000 years of records of how the reefs were looking like, and names of different places in the reefs and so on. And this is really, in a sense, because we have been able to make a living out of the reefs. We have been at one point cowrie shells, and then later on just to let you see it so that we can charge you. But in so many ways, our reefs have been assisting us with our livelihood, and therefore it is so much easier, and therefore it is so much possible for us to find ways and means of looking after them. We also have another very interesting piece of research that's on soft engineering, using coral for engineering. We've been building harbors, embankments, water breakers, revetments, and so on. And we've been doing that with a lot of concrete and by destroying the reef. We wanted to have a look at how people have done in all sorts of other places where they've been using the environment, using the reef as a structure, and instead of building another structure. So we have these two pieces of research material that we've collected together, and I'm sure that it's going to be very exciting, and you will be able to ask whatever question that you want from our panel of very clever people. Very often, I am accused of supporting government policies, let's say for dredging or building a harbor or development. One of the points here is that we would like to find a development strategy that is less extractive and more recycling, and also with a far more softer engineering, biological engineering in the sense. So basically, to use the reef as a structure, a biological structure that would be purposeful for whatever we would like to do. For instance, if it was a harbor or a water breaker, or just to make sure that there is no erosion, or for diving or whatever. Well, anyway, I look forward for the presentations, and thank you very much. Zaheena, there you are.
Great. So the first presentation tonight is going to come from Professor Callum Roberts, and his is titled "The Development of Coral Science in the Maldives."
Thank you very much, Rasheed, for that very excellent introduction. One of the things that I have as my ton of the research that has been done on Maldivian reefs in the past, think about what it means for our understanding of the present and for the research priorities of the Maldives Coral Institute. My collaborator in this is somebody called Lucy Howarth Forster, and Lucy has very diligently worked with me to search the literature and to try and find every study that we can hunt down on research on Maldivian reefs, going back as far as is possible in the literature. Let me just try and advance this slide for you. While my screen is sharing, there we go. That's better. I think we're on track now. So we're thinking about the past in order to understand the present. One of the things about the world around us is that it's very dynamic, that we are looking at a system that is changing. And in the recent decades of the Anthropocene, we now recognize it's changing much faster than in the past. And so we need to see how coral reefs are responding to the changes that humanity is imposing upon the planet. And so scientific research is essential to that. And for the Maldives Coral Institute, in order to frame its scientific research program, we really need to understand what has been done, what are the focuses that people's research has had in the past, and how is that changing? What are we thinking about as the research needs for tomorrow? So we found 436 publications going back to 1835. And you can see that there has been a very rapid growth in the number of publications resulting from research on coral reefs in the country. And in particular, in the last 2 decades, roughly 2/3 of the studies that we found had been published in that period. And that means that, you know, there's a welcome surge in research after a long hiatus, really, throughout much of the published on Maldivian reefs. And that's a huge gap, because the Maldives has probably one of the most well-developed, impressive coral provinces on planet Earth. And I think it is such an important place for coral reefs. It deserves to be very prominent in research on understanding of coral reefs. Now, interestingly, it was incredibly prominent right from the beginning. This beautiful map of the country was created by Captain Robert Moresby, who published it in 1835 after lengthy periods surveying the reefs of the country. And you can see it's remarkably accurate. This is a very passable map for the Maldives, even using modern mapping. And what was interesting was that about the same time, Charles Darwin was circling them up with the theory of evolution, but also to present the first really scientific understanding of how coral reefs formed, and in particular, how atolls formed through a process of island subsidence. And Robert Moresby corresponded extensively with Charles Darwin over testing his theories in the Maldivian archipelago. And unfortunately, he tried drilling through one of the atolls and didn't get very deep down. But certainly he demonstrated that there was coral going down quite some distance. You can see from this diagram the varying nature of the studies that we looked at, and they're categorized into 10 different subjects here, from zoology and geomorphology, which otherwise is the study of reef structure and development. And you can see that these early studies really on reef development, and those are the things that people were trying to do. They're trying to understand, how do coral reefs form? How are they able to survive in areas of very high wave action, for example, in the middle of oceans? And they were naming species. They were looking at things, describing them for the first time, and putting them as part of the pantheon of human knowledge. What you can see from this, though, is that the reef research changed over time, and really coming in the 1970s, we begin to see the first studies of ecology, or how the environment functions in terms of food webs, for example, and how corals grow, what their environmental needs are. And fisheries too. We can see the emergence of fisheries science, because obviously people were thinking about how to feed the population and how to manage fisheries in a sustainable way. And then later on, through the 1990s to the present, we see the emergence of studies on human impacts, climate change, and of course, conservation of coral reefs into the future. Certain things have really predominated in people's minds throughout this period, depending upon what was going on at the time. And you can see here a couple of subjects of research which were particularly notable during the 1980s and 90s. Coral mining was at the forefront there. There were proposals to mine entire reefs to provide building materials for the country. It turned out that that was considered later on to be a bad idea, and that coral reefs are better intact and thriving than creating walls for buildings. And so we've seen that the Maldives has banned coral mining for construction now. The tsunami of 2004 prompted a burst of research onto tsunami impacts on the coral reefs. And in fact, the general conclusion from that is the reefs were fairly unaffected on the whole by the tsunami, whereas, of course, we know that the population suffered considerably from the impact of that huge event. Something else, though, which has seen bursts of research is coral bleaching. And coral bleaching is a phenomenon which is worldwide, where corals are exposed to high temperatures, and where you get these kind of marine heat waves, corals lose their symbiotic algae, which provide much of the nutrition that turns them white, and they die en masse. And in 1997-98, the Maldives suffered an extreme coral bleaching event, which led to the death of over 90% of the coral throughout many parts of the country. And that bleaching interest continued for a considerable period thereafter, but then was rekindled by another major global coral reef bleaching event during the 2015-16. One of the interesting things about research on coral reefs in the country is that it's been distributed relatively well across the country. I mean, there are certain hotspots of research interest, for example, around North and South Malé. Those are places which are particularly accessible, but the whole country from north to south is involved in coral research with some notable omissions. Relatively unstudied reefs, then there's a good picture of where to go from this this graph. And Formula, for example, in the far south would be a place to undertake significant research on coral reefs, as would some of those more northerly reefs which have been relatively neglected over the years. This panel of 3 maps is illustrating how research has increased in intensity over time during the 1990s to the present decade, and how it has been distributed geographically atolls, but few atolls have been left out entirely. And that's encouraging, because it gives us something to draw upon when it comes to learning about how coral reefs have changed in the past within the country. And one of the things that we've done is to try and gain a picture of the changing fortunes of coral in the Maldives over time. And of course, these coral reef bleaching events were a massive wake-up call for the whole world. It was a shocking level of mortality, which people saw after the 97-98 bleaching event. And what is even more shocking, I think, in my view, is how underreported that was to the world as a whole at the time. I mean, imagine if 70 or 80% of the trees in Europe or America were to have died over one summer, and how much kind of tearing of hair there would be, of scientific studies commissioned to find out what was going wrong, to bring back the forest, campaigning done, and yet largely this 1997-98 event was only remarked by a fairly small number of scientists. The other thing which is difficult is to see where coral was in past times when few scientists were active and looking at reefs. And so what we tried to do was to identify research which really goes back as far in time as possible to reconstruct a record of what was a typical Maldivian reef like, let's say in the 1950s or so. So this is what the findings showed. The brown line is the trajectory of coral cover change in the Maldives, plotted since 1950, which was the earliest data that we could get hold of, through to the present. And then the gray line in the background was a previous attempt by Mori et al. To plot the same sort of trajectory of coral cover change in the country up to and just preceding the 2015-16 bleaching event. And what you can see from this is that there are some clear signals in here. Obviously, the 97-98 bleaching event had a massive impact on coral cover in the country, and it plummeted from probably 40 to 50% cover down to only a few percent cover. This was completely unprecedented as far as we're aware. The second thing which is really apparent from this is the strength of the recovery response following that bleaching event. There is a very rapid resurgence in coral cover across the atolls of the country, bringing it up almost to levels seen prior to 1997-98. And then, of course, bad things happen again. But one of the things which is interesting about the research is it suggests that the second bleaching event, although the conditions were as extreme as previously, there was less of a reduction in coral cover. The other intriguing thing from this is that there is a suggestion from both studies, from Mori et al. And this one, that coral cover had already declined somewhat from the 90s before this first major bleaching event. And one has to speculate about the causes of that, what sort of impacts were going on, what kind of environmental changes more broadly were happening, which might have driven that. And there is also the possibility that this may be an artifact of the data, and that as you go back in time, there are fewer and fewer studies, and so they may be more atypical than the years for which we have multiple studies of coral cover. And so one of the things that this study does is to tell us where we need more data. And I think one of the things that the Maldives Coral Institute is going to want to pursue in the coming years is really to try and find, is this the limit of coral data available in the country? Can we go back further? Can we find, for example, underwater footage which we could use to reinterpret changes over time? Can we find early studies which have inventoried corals prior to any of the publications that we came across here? This is very much not a comprehensive piece of research as yet. 436 publications is good going, but it's not all of them. And it also misses out a big chunk of research which has been done in country and published in grey literature reports, for example, environmental impact assessments and so forth. And one of the things that we want to try and do is to incorporate that into this building of a picture of how reefs have changed in the country over time. One of the intriguing things that's come out of the studies so far is that there is a suggestion that the reefs of the north have recovered less well than the reefs of central and southern regions. And we have limited data because that was one of the areas that was relatively neglected in terms of science, but certainly it accords with some of my experiences where reefs in the far north appear to still be worse off than reefs in central and southern sections, certainly up to the point of the second coral bleaching in 2015-16. So one of the things for the future is really to get a much richer and more textured view of coral change in the country, and to identify areas where corals appear to be more resilient, for example, than they are in other areas. Now, the Maldives Marine Research Institute has got a network of monitoring stations established across the atolls, 15 permanent stations in 7 atolls. But one of the opportunities here is that there are 114 resorts spread over at least 18 atolls. And certainly I would see a role to be played by some of these resorts in contributing to a citizen science program of monitoring of Maldivian reefs, so that what we can see then is a much more detailed picture of changing cover across the country, and we can find places where corals are faring well and places where they're faring particularly badly. I think the context for this is very clear. The Maldives is entirely dependent on its coral reefs for a huge number of aspects of life. Indeed, survival in the country is only possible because of the coral reefs. And yet, those coral reefs have also proven themselves to be incredibly fragile in the face of climate change. And this reef in particular, you know, one of the richest and most beautiful in Fafu Atoll, which was very heavily impacted by the 2015-16 bleaching event. So I think just to wind up, priorities for the Maldives Coral Institute really focus on thinking about how reefs will fare in the coming century. How can we help find ways of promoting coral survival and growth and maintaining their vigor in order to ensure the future survival of the Maldives as a country? And noting, of course, that this is a country that must develop in order to grow and fulfill the needs and aspirations of its people. Infrastructure development is a necessary part of that, particularly as sea levels rise. And so one of the things that has to be done is to balance development around reefs with meeting the needs of reefs to continue thriving. And of course, two of these priorities for the Maldives Coral Institute are not about science, but are about the dissemination of science and the introduction of that scientific understanding into policy. And both are absolutely essential for sustainable development of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Callum. To all of our participants who are tuning in, there's a tab at the bottom that says Q&A where you can type in your questions. We have about 5 minutes or so if you wanted to ask Professor Callum about some of the findings that he's just presented. And in the meantime, I have a question of my own. I was wondering, the recovery, obviously the stats are amazing in terms of that it did recover so fast, but is there data on whether the types of coral were different when they came back?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is the types of coral that came back were a subset of the corals that were originally present. The ones that really boomed back quickly are especially things like the acroporas, which grow fast. They settle prolifically onto Maldivian reefs, and they occupy space very quickly. So I guess in a terrestrial context, those would be the weeds on the reefs. But weeds are pretty good for doing things like providing shelter for a whole range of organisms and protection against wave action. Obviously, over time, you would expect the recovery to change as slower growing species, the more rare species start to come back as well. Clearly, one of the big contributors to reef growth and development is this kind of weedy subset of acroporas. And so they're really vital to the future of the country, in that they are providing much of the protection against wave action. For example, they're providing material that forms the islands, and they are also among the most vulnerable whenever a bleaching event comes along. So trying to figure out how to maintain those very strong, actively growing corals that generate the reef structure itself is going to be a big challenge.
we have a few questions. One of them is from Mark Linus, and he asks, any guesses on long-term survival prospects for Maldives coral, given multiple repeated bleaching events?
That's a very good question. I think the prospects for coral reefs across the world have been assessed a number of times, particularly by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I think the answer is that they are bleak to appalling, the prospects. Under the worst case sort of scenarios, coral reefs would cease to exist in the way that we understand them today, or certainly in the past. But I think there is a more optimistic viewpoint here, and that is that coral reefs are changing fast, and reef building corals are not the only organisms on those reefs, and there are many aspects of reef development which are promoted by that whole range of other organisms. And some of the reefs that I visited in the far north of the country, where there have been very little recovery from the 1987, 98 bleaching event, there might have been 4% coral cover there, living coral cover, but there were some of the most remarkable fish communities that I've seen on reefs anywhere in the world. And that's because they have been well protected and well managed in other aspects. So they are still going to be incredibly important to the livelihoods of people in the country, but they may not be performing the same sort of roles in terms of coastal protection, for example. And that's going to require solutions in the country which, will involve infrastructure engineering. It will require building sea defenses. There is going to need to be a response within the country to these challenges, but that really needs to be in a kind of no regrets way. And that's the nature of Georgia's work, which is coming up in the next presentation. So I'm not going to preempt it here, but I think the future for coral reefs is much better if we don't give up on them now and we manage and protect them as well as we can.
Zaheena, can I say a word? Professor, I think the question came from Mark Linus. You might remember he's the genetic engineering man who later, he's got his new book, Seeds of Science. I think part of the question there was on resilient coral. Are we able to find a species that would survive 50 years later? Are we going to assist evolution so that we may have, this biodiversity probably is lost, but what would be the biodiversity available to maybe 20, 30 years later? Yes, Professor, but Zaheena, please go ahead. There's so many other questions, Professor Roberts.
So I agree with you on
maybe you should add, come to the answer of what I said after a number of these other questions.
Okay. Let's do that.
You can't be taking so much time over a single question.
Well, unfortunately, we actually have to move to Georgia's presentation now. All of these other questions we can come back to during the panel discussion. So we will definitely be raising them. So for Georgia's presentation, she's from the University of York. Hers is called Managing Development to Protect Coral Reefs. It examines the different types of infrastructure development in other countries which can be used in the Maldives. And I think it's particularly interesting given how in the past couple of years, we've seen unprecedented amount of reclamation in the Maldives. So as President Rasheed has said, it's quite destructive to our environment. So let's hear what Georgia has to say.
Thank you, Zaheena. So I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of the research that I've been doing the past couple of months, looking at reducing the impacts of coastal development on coral reefs. So the Maldives is hugely reliant on its coral reefs. It's one of the most coral-dependent countries in the world. The low-lying islands exist because reefs act as powerful natural barriers to wave action and storms. Fishing and tourism are two of the largest industries in the Maldives and are dependent on these healthy, vibrant and productive reefs. Coral reefs are therefore of the utmost importance to the country, its economy and the well-being of its people. Maldives is currently undergoing rapid economic and population growth, leading to extensive coastal development. Sea level rise driven by climate change represents an urgent new reality that developers must respond to if the country is to remain habitable. Big infrastructure projects will be a necessary part of meeting this challenge, but they need to be undertaken in ways that will protect the natural defences that coral reefs provide. So in the Maldives, there's sort of a big 5 types of coastal development, which include coastal stabilisation and erosion control. So this is maybe through sand pumping or hard structures such as breakwaters. Resort construction and maintenance, which are increasingly building on top of coral reefs. Harbour construction and dredging of access channels. Airport runway building and island building. All of these are going to have huge, and island building. So all of these are going to have huge impacts on coral reefs. For coral reefs to thrive, there are a number of key conditions. So this is linked to water temperature. So diverse coral communities and well-developed reefs typically occur in waters between 18 to 28 centigrade. They require ample light for the symbiotic algae, the zooxanthellae, to photosynthesize and provide energy for the coral polyps. They require hard substrate and a stable seabed and clear water. So turbid water with high levels of suspended sediment or organic matter can restrict light needed for photosynthesis. And sediment can smother or bury coral polyps. And then they must use energy that would otherwise be put into growth and reproduction to remove the sediment. High levels of nutrients will degrade coral reefs, and they need really good water circulation. So the hydrological conditions can affect temperature, nutrients, and sediment loading. Collectively, these factors affect the coral growth rate, growth form, reproduction, and the composition and diversity of coral communities. So if we think back to those big 5 developments, all of these are going to impact coral reefs and these key conditions for them to thrive in. So development is going to cause a physical loss and damage through infrastructure or dredging. It's going to alter the light availability for photosynthesis. So sort of turbidity caused by sediment suspended during operations, or loss of light from shading due to these infrastructures, particularly like the water bungalows above coral reefs. It's going to cause sediment loading and smothering from deposition of material. Going to alter the water quality around the area. So this is through contamination and release of wastewater or pollution or synthetic compounds. And these developments are going to have big impacts on the hydrodynamics. Even temporary structures that are installed for the construction phase can have big impacts on wave climate and currents. So development, there's also some indirect effects on coral reefs, which is loss of important habitat for juvenile fish. So this could be through deliberate removal of seagrass or mangroves, introduction of non-native species, underwater noise pollution, light pollution, and mortality of marine wildlife during operations. And these are all going to have sort of knock-on effects on the food web and on coral reefs in general. So developments need to mitigate some of these impacts to ensure that there's a no regrets policy to development. Avoiding impacts entirely is not always possible, and so developers must apply a mitigation hierarchy, aiming to minimize unavoidable impacts before compensating and then offsetting impacts where they remain significant. Mitigation can be addressed in two ways. So through the planning, design and construction, and also through monitoring and ongoing management of development, which should be adaptive. If we take a look at some of the planning stage, lots of the avoidance and minimization measures are incorporated into the project during the design phase. A detailed environmental assessment should be carried out, which involves a real stepwise process of evaluating the alternative options. So this can be in terms of locations or methods, and alternatives should be fully evaluated before compensation options are considered. These impact assessments need to obtain relevant and accurate baseline data, which must address the spatial scale of the project, and this includes impacts outside the immediate area of development and the temporal scale of the project. Predictive numerical modelling of physical and ecological processes is essential for assessing the impacts, but it does require good information, valid assumptions, and assessment by qualified experts. Tolerance limits are really important to quantify the amount of change that corals can withstand. So often establishing these limits, especially for turbidity, light attenuation, and sedimentation, is complex, but they are critical. Tolerance limits should take into account both the magnitude and the duration of the impact. And at this stage, they will be preliminary, so they should be conservative. They can always be revised during the monitoring and management stages. Their corals have a wide range of sensitivity levels. So for instance, the duration that corals can survive high turbidities ranges from several days for sensitive species to at least 5 to 6 weeks for tolerant species. And so therefore, limits should be based on site-specific data. Development should use environmental windows where work is restricted under certain conditions. This may be on a daily basis, so for example, with the direction of the tide, and it could be limitations during adverse weather conditions or on a seasonal basis to prevent sensitive periods. So particularly with developments near coral reefs, should be really sort of sensitive to coral spawning seasons and periods of the year with high risk of external stress. So this is sort of, for example, in elevated temperatures where bleaching is likely to occur. Development should establish protocols for limiting the work site to reduce the area directly or indirectly impacted. And this can be as simple as redesigning development to avoid construction over the reefs themselves or the area of reef exposed to adverse impact. We have a quick look at a few technical mitigation measures, which can range from relatively simple to more complex, and all should be considered and as many as possible used. A relatively simple example is the use of low impact mooring buoys to reduce anchor impacts. And this might be appropriate for mitigating relatively short-term impacts from cable deployment during development, as well as during the operational phase of resorts and harbours. Quick look at dredging. So there are 3 main phases: the excavation of sediment, the transport, and the disposal or placement. And mitigation measures can be incorporated at all 3 stages. And again, planning is really important. The depth and the intensity of dredging should be taken into consideration, and this is going to be site-specific. The mitigation can come in the form of the choice of dredger, establishing a production rate, operational methods such as minimizing the propeller wash, and restricting overflow through the use of technologies such as butterfly valve or an environmental valve. And this is really important because concentrations of suspended sediment within 200 meters of the dredge are documented to be 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher when overflow is allowed. There's also the use of silt curtains, bunds, or rigid barriers to minimize the transport of sediment. And again, the placement technique should be considered. So there's different sort of spatial and temporal scales that will have different impacts, and the proximity of coral reefs should be taken into account. Sometimes impacts are unavoidable, and in such cases, compensation mechanisms can be used. In the Maldives, generally, it has typically favoured hard structures such as breakwaters rather than soft solutions. And elsewhere in the world, there's sort of been quite an emphasis on using sort of soft structures and eco-engineering. So use of mangroves in, for example, Indonesia, or salt marshes in more temperate regions as coastal stabilization. And so this really emphasizes the importance of conserving these similar ecosystems. So in the Maldives, this would be sort of mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrass, and their role in coastal stabilization and as protection from waves and storms cannot be underestimated. Environmentally friendly grey infrastructure has also been promoted. So one example is the use of reef balls of breakwaters. So reef balls are made using bio-enhancing concrete, which has a similar pH to the ocean and a texture that facilitates coral settlement. They mimic the structure and function of a natural reef, but can also lead to sand accretion on beaches. So you can see here an example from the Dominican Republic. In 3 years, there's been a huge amount of sand sort of deposited on the island as a result of a submerged breakwater. But obviously these are also going to change the surrounding hydrological systems, so that does need to be taken into consideration during the planning phases. Compensation and offset actions can include re-establishment of coral populations or habitats in damaged areas or alternative areas. Techniques include reef repair, coral transplant, coral seeding, and construction of artificial reefs. There have been many success stories of transplantation, but survival is highly dependent on the species studied and is strongly influenced by the transplantation technique. Although there have been some success stories, it should not be used as an excuse for poorly managed development. Undamaged coral reefs that have taken thousands of years to form are far more diverse and productive and will consequently provide a greater suite of ecosystem services. And so the mitigation should therefore prioritise in minimising the impacts of development. So as a conclusion, just some recommendation would be to avoid impacts completely where possible and minimise direct destruction to coral reefs by careful design and through planning processes. Suspend sediment releasing activities before, during and after coral spawning periods and when thermal stress is expected to occur. Undertake comprehensive impact assessments that incorporate the combined effect of developments. This includes past, present and future actions, and also takes into consideration the entire lifespan of developments, including maintenance and decommission. Also, to maintain adjacent ecosystems such as seagrass and mangroves, minimise the hydrological effects of development through planning and design, and don't sort of underestimate the interconnectivity of all these ecosystems. Use all available technology to mitigate the harmful impacts of development, and developments would benefit from a greater scrutiny of environmental impact assessments and greater emphasis placed on knowledge sharing, monitoring, and the development of best practice guidelines. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Georgia, for that. If there are no questions from the audience, we shall break for about 5 minutes and come back for to the panelist discussion. Is that good?
Okay.
Okay, all right. So we shall resume in 5 minutes. All right. So the next part of this webinar is going to be a panel discussion with both Georgia, Callum, but also Kathryn who is the executive director of the Weight Institute. We have Shaha Hashim from the Maldives. She's from the Blue Marine Foundation. And then we also have Dr. David Obura, who is from the IUCN and the University of Queensland. So I'd like to ask the three panelists who haven't spoken so far to give a quick introduction about themselves and their work, as well as maybe share a few thoughts on what they've heard from Callum and Georgia and how it relates to the work that they're doing in the Maldives or elsewhere. So maybe we can start with Kathryn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zaheena. And thank you to the panelists for your presentation so far. I have lots of notes and lots of questions that I will hold because I think there's so many good ones coming from the audience as well. So I am the executive director of the Weight Institute, and we are a nonprofit from the United States that work in partnership with governments and with other organizations to support marine spatial planning, blue economy, and sustainable fisheries. And we started a program of work with the government of the Maldives just about a year ago now. And we have been working with the government and with others to support the Maldives in developing a path forward as it relates to sustainable oceans. So the topics described here today are very much of interest to us and the work that we're doing. One of the things that we did are just really finishing up and have a little bit of work left to do on is to support an expedition that I think several people who are on this call have participated in. I sadly was not one of the people out at sea, but was back in the office. But that expedition was an effort to do a comprehensive baseline assessment across the Maldives to visit most of the atolls from north to south. And unfortunately, we have yet to complete the southern atolls because that phase of the expedition was planned just as COVID disrupted all of our lives. But we are working now to figure out when we can complete that assessment. So our hope is that we can use this information to help feed into the work that the Maldives Coral Institute is doing, as well as supporting the work of the Maldives Marine Research Institute and others, and understanding what is the current state of the status of the coral reefs in the Maldives. In addition to working in the water, though, a big part of our work is to think about what kind of laws, policies, plans can help facilitate long-term sustainable oceans. And so I thought that on that note, I might provide a few comments that relate to the presentations so far to stimulate some additional discussion and maybe suggest some additional research. So one of the things that I think that in thinking about especially the coral decline that you've seen, in addition to the major bleaching events, of course, you see trends over time in terms of both improvements, but also loss of coral reefs. And we know and understand that in addition to climate change, things like, in terms of what Georgia talked about, development can impact and destroy corals. Overfishing can impact corals. Onshore activities that cause runoff, sewage, those types of things are also major impacts to corals. And so in thinking about how to ensure resilience of corals so that they are able to respond to extreme heat or other impacts from climate change, the question is, what are the human conditions that can be removed to give those corals the best chance at survival? And in that vein, one of the questions I had for the researchers was, or suggestions is to look, in addition to looking at coral reef studies specifically over time, is there a way to marry that with trends in terms of human development, human use, other types of studies that look at our changes in terms of sewage or other types of runoff? Do those changing processes affect the health of the coral reefs, or can you look at least at correlations between human use of the ocean or human impact to the ocean and the health and function of the coral reef ecosystems? And then the second piece of the puzzle in my mind on the issue of resilience and how to achieve it is one, so understanding what these impacts are. Two, to George's presentation, of course, is to make sure that you have the mitigation systems in place. So that also gets into the world of law and policy. How do you design, or do you have the legal framework that you need in order to require developers to effectively mitigate their impacts? Another thing to think about is not just intentional damage to ecosystems, but accidental. So, I mean, if you look right now off of the coast of Mauritius, of course, is an extreme example of oil spill affecting coral reef ecosystems. And does the Maldives have the systems in place and the legal frameworks in place to hold companies accountable for those types of damages so that you can mitigate the impacts or try to recover from the impacts of accidental activities? In addition to things like oil spills, it can be running boats up on reefs and so on and so forth. But what I'm getting at is the idea that there's this death by 1,000 cuts that we see in the environmental world. And what we want to ensure from policies and processes is that you have the best mechanisms in place to prevent that. And so then I'll get to my last point, and then I'll turn it over to the others, is that in addition to the small scale or development, site-by-site planning, I think it's important to have large-scale planning. And that's another component of the work that we're supporting is marine spatial planning, to look at holistically, how do you use the ecosystem in a comprehensive way? Because if you imagine that, you know, one development may not cause a lot of impacts, but 1,000 of those same developments could be catastrophic. So if you plan with the intention of knowing how much can you push on an ecosystem, how much do you need to utilize, and then how much do you need to protect or conserve in order to maintain the function of the ecosystem, through long-term planning processes, you have better mechanisms to look at that in that comprehensive way. So those are the things that are on my mind that hopefully can fit into the research portfolio in terms of moving forward.
Great. Shah?
Yeah, thank you, MCI, and for Callum and Georgia for the wonderful presentation. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Shaha, and I'm the Maldives Project Manager for Blue Marine Foundation, or Blue. Blue is a UK-based charity working to increase marine protection across the world. And we've been working in the Maldives for the past 4 years under the umbrella of Maldives Resilient Reefs, which is now a registered local entity as well. So the four main objectives of our work in the Maldives is increasing marine protection, sustainable development of tourism, sustainable fisheries, and capacity strengthening of local marine conservationists. I think many of you might have seen the Fish for Tomorrow campaign that we recently ran, and the Protect Maldives Seagrass campaign that we ran last year. So I hope you're all familiar with our work as well. I would like to thank MCI for delivering this very important piece of research especially after the discussions we've had at the Coral Festival workshop held in Toulouse earlier this year. And before I share the rest of my feedback, I would like to echo the sentiments of several Maldivians, young and old, in saying that we can't ignore the urgency in discontinuing the destructive development activities that have both increased in number and scale over the past few years. I hope that the duty bearers listening in today would take these recommendations on board urgently and pilot some of these recommendations as well. The most interesting part of the presentations was the coral cover baselines, which is something very new, and it opens a lot of doors for additional research. I think it would help greatly with the management planning processes that we have all embarked on, and will help researchers undertaking coral reef studies about the Maldives. In the graph that Professor Callum presented, we saw that prior to the 1970s, the coral cover baseline was 60 to 70%, which is very interesting. This is something that we didn't know before. From the 1970s to 1990, coral cover declined to 30%. And it's not really understood why this had happened. But I think it's also, as Kathryn said, it's important to look into this further to see what other anthropogenic impacts may have correlated with this. This is the period when tourism sector and the fisheries sector expanded at a very rapid rate, especially in the central atolls. And as Dr. Nasir mentioned in the Q&A chat, this was also when coral mining was quite rampant in the central atolls. So these are important things to consider. Then we saw that after the dramatic decline in 1998, coral cover recovered to pre-1990 levels until 2010. But then again, after that, there's a very worrying declining trend. I think we need to also look into the impact of the destructive development activities that have taken place over the past few years. It's poorly researched and poorly understood. But a study conducted by La Rochelle University of France in 2019 found that the human footprint on Maldivian islands had increased drastically between the period 2004 and 6 and 2014 and 16. They sampled 50% of the Maldivian islands and found that almost 33% of the islands had a very high human footprint. Within just a decade, in fact, 65% of the inhabited and exploited islands had reclaimed areas, and 10% of the undisturbed shorelines had shoreline changes done by 2016. So I think there's a very big need to have a conversation about critical construction projects. What are the critical construction projects? At the moment, all the projects that are being undertaken are considered as critical projects. Most of these projects result from pledges made to island communities or promises to investors. And perhaps this is the reason why these projects are being rushed to be completed without due diligence to ensure environmental sustainability. I think it's come to a point where we need to realize that Mother Nature is not a promise on a ballot, and critically think the planned construction projects. We need to focus our development aim at adapting to the changing climate instead of focusing just on expansion of the sectors. Just before I finish, I think we also need to think critically about tourism expansion and development. We should look into the practices of other countries such as Palau, who have successfully managed their tourism industry by putting a cap on the number of visitors and focusing on high spending visitors to the country so that it benefits the environment and people as well. Yeah, so those are just like a few of my thoughts for now, and I'll share the rest with you later.
Isha, to all of our attendees, just be aware that you can submit questions on the Q&A, and the panelists can choose to answer the question live or type your answers. To Dr. David Obura now.
Hey, thank you very much, Zaheena, and thanks to the Maldives Coral Institute for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a pleasure. I haven't been to the Maldives, which I continuously regret, but I'd love to see your reefs, because I've spent a lot of time on reefs in other parts of the Indian Ocean. It's great to see some familiar faces, Callum, good friend and colleague from ages back, as well as some of the attendees. So, and I think it's really important to have these sorts of events to really highlight the case of coral reefs, what's happening in particular places, like in the Maldives. I think, well, sorry, first a bit of introduction about who I am and what I do. I'm a coral reef researcher. My primary affiliation is with the organization Cordio, or network called Cordio. And we started in '99 after the big bleaching event in '98. And in fact, we had a South Asia program that was very active in the Maldives. Hussein Zahir on the call was very active in that. And though we haven't maintained it in recent years, we really act as a reef research and monitoring network to try and build capacity, to get information and data out, to try and influence management and policy, and to really help build national systems and awareness around coral reefs. And now really using the case of coral reefs as a global flagship, because I think we really understand a lot about the vulnerabilities and what's really happening with reefs, and the time to act is now. I think Maldives has been inspiring as a country in what you have done because of your cultural and historical dependence on reefs, because of the leadership that you've had and the vulnerabilities that you've had to climate change and rising sea levels. I think President Rasheed's underwater cabinet meeting in 2009 was a real wake-up call to the world and at the top levels of government as to the importance that we have to put on coral reefs. And I think seeing that continue from the Maldives is critical. I think small island states or large ocean states, I think really are at the forefront of global awareness. And so I really applaud that, and we depend on that as professionals working on coral reef issues and sustainability. We really need that country level leadership to push the agenda and to move forward. And that's really supported by efforts like the Maldives Coral Institute, where in addition to governments and university type programs, you really engage at the civil society level around awareness of reefs, around promoting research and identifying priorities in research, priorities in action and management. And I think the two presentations we've heard have really highlighted that. I won't dwell on the research sides because I think Callum will expand on some of the questions that have already been posed. But one thing that concerns me always, and it's shown in one of the graphs that Callum showed, is this lag, the time it takes for research to come out in publications and the time it takes for research to get into policy. And we need to reduce those lag times. We need to use information as quickly as possible because the pressures and the threats are so imminent and they're growing by the day. So I think trying to address that through good national policies that fast track listening to the researchers and listening to communities and traditional knowledge and incorporating that into decision making. I think it's very important to identify national and local priorities for research. And a question did come up about research on genetics of corals and trying to generate stronger corals through the word genetic engineering is used, but that's a very emotive term. There are many different ways that you know, coral resistance could be improved through breeding or through genetic techniques or through sampling from different habitats. I think it's important to do that, but it's because we will need those techniques more and more in the future to help rebuild corals if we do everything right on climate change and the Paris Agreement. But it's very important for vulnerable countries to give strong directions, I think, on ecological research, reducing threats. Kathryn mentioned the death by 1,000 cuts, and I'm completely on board with that. We really have to make conditions as good as possible for corals to deal with the inevitable threats like warming, which is certain levels of warming, and to help build adaptive capacity and resilience. So I'll lead quickly into the presentation by George on coastal development, because I think identifying you know, coral reef friendly development options is critical. I think the move towards gray-green or hybrid infrastructure that really looks at natural habitats like reefs, mangroves, seagrass beds as infrastructure for development. They provide so many services that we need to really identify what those are and quantify how important they are, not just in monetary terms, but how many people are supported, what sorts of livelihoods, what sorts of cultural practices and dependencies are supported, because then we can really focus on development actions that are culturally appropriate and really support people, not just economy and money and generation. I think in looking at reef restoration, it's very important to look at it from a ecosystem-based approach as opposed to just growing individual corals. What ecological functions can be restored in a reef if you have the techniques to do that, and what ecosystem services or what benefits to people can be provided through restoration. And if we can't do that yet, then I think restoration really has to be pitched as research and trials rather than as solutions. We need to really identify who benefits and from what types of restoration actions, because then you can really address the social issues. I think the Maldives is a country that really highlights the social and the just aspects of what we need to do in terms of looking after coral reefs and trying to save them because of the dependence on reefs. So, you know, the concept of climate justice and the concept of social equity and benefits from reefs is critically important. And I think in this respect, of course, a lot of what we need to do comes to transforming what companies do in terms of economic growth and development and practices. And there is a big movement towards developing science-based targets for nature. So identifying what responsibilities companies have and individual entities to do their part to maintain natural systems and to restore them. So I think the mitigation hierarchy that Georgia mentioned is very important. And there's some new work coming out now around science-based targets for nature that build on the mitigation hierarchy to really drive home what sorts of things need to be done. So I think this aspect of coral reefs and climate change, countries like the Maldives where dependency is high, can really drive the agenda globally, not just nationally, in terms of pitching for what needs to be done. And this decade, with the new Convention on Biological Diversity targets that we're discussing now, which will be in operation for the next 30 years, with the Sustainable Development Goals for the next 10 years and the decade of ocean science for sustainability. I think there are real opportunities for leadership here. So I'll just finish with saying that I think this discussion is very important. And I think really the work that is a priority for MCI in terms of looking at the importance of cultural relevance, engagement, public motivation to sustain coral reefs is critically important. I think as a scientist, I say we know enough to act now. We need to act now. Of course, we need more research. We always do that, but we should not feel we should hold back good actions just because we're not quite sure enough. We have to apply a precautionary principle. I think the Sustainable Development Goals provide an excellent framework, you know, agreed at the top level at governments and at the United Nations to do this, but not just for national actions, also for individuals, communities, and companies also to do their part. So, thank you.
you, Dr. David. So I'm going to open the floor to questions, and I'd like to start with one for Georgia. I was wondering, is the mitigation measures that you were talking about, are there countries that have been doing this pretty well, or not I mean, countries, territories, or areas, or is this something that's fairly new?
I think there needs to be a lot more research. I think there are sort of countries that are doing bits and pieces. For example, sort of using submerged breakwaters is happening in places like Mexico and things. But I think a lot of the work that's done, because it comes through sort of EIA, there's not a lot of sharing of this information. So it was actually, when I was doing the research, it was quite hard to come across sort of a lot of the more scientific research. And I think there needs to be a lot more sharing with sort of ways to mitigate in the with development around the world. There's quite a lot of information out there about dredging, and focused on sort of America, but yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more, and a way to share it and have it sort of more scientifically sort of scrutinized.
Well, that leads to one of the points raised by one of the attendees, Ibrahim Muhammad. He's saying one of the most critical pledges of the current government was to make an independent EPA to strengthen regulatory enforcement related to development proposals. So he's asking why is the EPA not made independent? And I want, maybe the panelists can answer, can talk about whether that's important, of having an independent watchdog. Anybody can jump in here.
If I could jump in, Zaheena, I think that is very important. And I think one of the things which has frustrated people in the Maldives is to see developments being undertaken without the extreme care which is necessary to be afforded to coral reefs and their associated habitats, because of the immense value of those reefs to the country. And you know, every reef is precious. Every reef needs to be safeguarded to the extent possible, while recognizing that the country needs to develop and fulfill the needs and the aspirations of its people. So I think a very good place to go would be to have independent oversight of development, and to incorporate global best practices into the legal framework for developments associated with reefs and seagrass beds and mangrove forests and so on. What we were surprised about, I think, as Georgia alluded to, was how the research that's out there and the information available doesn't lead you to think that there is any kind of exemplar country which is doing a really great job and protecting its assets incredibly well. And that really what we've got to do is to find elements of good practice from different places and develop local good practices as well in country, and enshrine them into a legal framework which guides all citizens and all developments. The MCI is in the process of exploring this kind of legal work and thinking about how do you know, looking at laws in place in various countries with coral reefs, and finding out what is applicable in the Maldives, what would be a good element of a law in order to safeguard the country's natural assets, and to think about how that then could be presented to policymakers in the country to consider creating a more robust framework for reducing damage to coral reefs.
Can I just add something to Callum's comments? Yeah, I fully agree with you, Callum, and David as well. in saying that we need to transform into a nature-based coral reef-friendly development agenda. I think the legal framework is pretty solid in terms of environmental protection, but there are obviously things that need to be done. The main issue that we have at the moment is the delivery or the implementation of these regulations. Like even in 2018, there was talk about protecting areas, protecting 10% of atolls, uninhabited islands, lagoons, mangrove, seagrass, but not much has been delivered as of yet. So I think we all need to push for the protection of conserving high biodiversity areas, a large portion of the remaining undisturbed shorelines and coral reefs, as well as all of the mangroves and a representative percentage of seagrass meadows across the country. If we don't do this, I'm afraid that we might not be able to overcome the challenges that we will have to face over the coming years. I don't think we have the time to destroy and build back now. I think our main focus should be on controlling the damage and trying to restore the habitats. Yeah, thank you.
Great. This leads to another question from Abdullah Nasir. He's saying the Maldives and the great atoll nations of the Pacific may be very similar in the type of reef resources we are trying to conserve. What are the differences in our approach to management, and can we share, build on or learn from atoll and coral dependent reef nations? Would a science alliance on coral reef dependent nations work? Dr. David?
Yes, thank you. So that is a great question. I think one thing we're also learning is that people learn a lot more quickly from peers and people that they have some connection to than from people who are very different or experts or professionals preaching about what should be done. And I think there's already a lot of sharing that's happening so at government levels between in the SIDS framework between governments of island nations like the Maldives and those in the Pacific. And I think the more that is done, the better, and the more there's also sharing between scientific institutions, between community networks as well. For example, in East Africa, we have a lot of interest in locally managed marine areas. And that was built up a lot through some connections with Fiji in the South Pacific, an experience that has been had over there. So I think fostering these sorts of exchanges so people can see the context of other island nations and really experience it and talk to one another. These sorts of exchange visits are very useful. Of course, the world is very different now with COVID and how we can travel back and forth in the coming years. But these sorts of virtual exchanges will be much more comfortable for everybody in the coming years. So really promoting these exchanges, I think, would be very, very valuable and very productive.
If I could add to that, one of the interesting features of the Pacific Ocean was that it was a major theater of war during World War II. And as part of that play of war across the Pacific, there was a huge amount of development and construction on island nations and atoll nations of the Pacific. And those constructions were not well planned. They were not done in ways which was designed to safeguard the the diversity or beauty of the reefs on which they were made. So airports were constructed, harbors were dug out, causeway roads were created, channels were cut, and all of this happening some 70 years ago gives us a laboratory in which to investigate with hindsight what the impacts of each of those kinds of developments had over the long term on these reefs, and which ones have reefs coped with and been able to it kind of accommodate, and which ones caused lasting damage, which has been incredibly destructive. So I think there is an opportunity there for research with partner nations in the Pacific to really try and understand the longer term impacts of really major coastal infrastructure developments and how they play out over decadal timescales. I've dived in a number of places in the Pacific, very close to where major constructions were undertaken during World War II, and some of them look amazing today, and you would almost not have a clue that the development had ever happened. And others have had very lasting impacts. So, you know, there is research to be done there, I think, which would be really informative for future construction efforts around reefs. Kiribati, for example, has just announced that it is partnering with China to really build up islands to avoid sea level rise and to keep the country in business for the next century. And those kinds of developments need that baseline of good science, I think, to avoid mistakes and to promote the best practices.
So I might add and shift a little bit, but picking up on this idea, one of the things that we see, not just in the Pacific, but I think also coming largely out of the Caribbean, where you have substantial economies that are highly dependent on tourism, is especially right now a look at, well, now what? How do countries, what does tourism look like in the future with COVID? And what are the other opportunities out there that are different from what we've seen? So instead of mass tourism, is there an expectation that it will be smaller scale, that it will be, you'll be drawing in a different type of clientele? But in addition to that, I think one of the other themes that we see globally is a push towards blue economy. And what that looks like for any country, and especially an island nation, I think is different. But are there other types of economic activities that can support people and communities and livelihoods that don't depend on highly destructive practices, whether it's ocean extraction activities or onshore development that causes major impact? So, and it's not to say that I'm advocating that, countries have to survive and they have to undertake certain types of development to survive. And I think all human impacts, are that. But I think there's also, a big interest globally in how to design blue economies that achieve long-term sustainable oceans and are long-term in terms of vision.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I'm sorry. See, a question asked is, can we use coral reefs as infrastructure, as structures? Basically, we need a harbor. The islands need a harbor, and they need the harbor to have calm waters, to have their boats. The question I'm asking is, the idea is to see if we can use the reef instead of breaking it up and coming up with a concrete structure. Can we grow the thing in a manner where it serves the purpose what people want? The people in the Maldives, in my view, are looking for three things from the coral, or three destructive things. One is harbors. They need harbors, and in my, very often it might be possible to do a harbor without destroying the reef, but using the reef as the water breaker or as the embankment. The other is coastal erosion. Again, for here, we use revetments, embankments, water breakers, and all sorts of heavy engineering to stop coastal erosion. Now, can we again grow a mangrove, implant a mangrove? Can we again grow the reef to make sure that this is happening? Another reason why why the reefs are under pressure is because of housing. Now, do we really have to reclaim? There are other floating technologies. I mean, we can be asking the people not to do these things, but I'm sorry, you know, what we're really seeing is if we go along these lines, we will be fighting a losing battle. People will, there might be some amount of people who will listen to us, but we need to satisfy their needs, meanwhile protecting the reefs. So coastal erosion, can we grow a reef? Harbors, can we create a harbor biologically, or can we grow a reef to form a harbor? Now I'm looking at a very outrageous thing where you have probably a hedge on top of a reef instead of a water breaker. So I'm really looking forward to see if there is science that can go in that direction. I feel it's a losing battle to talk about conservation without giving alternatives. I hope this makes sense.
Zaheena, may I respond a little bit after President Rasheed, because I really think he's hit the nail on the head. And my perspective is that the economic system, economic practices have been completely blinded by non-ecological or non-nature-based perspectives going back hundreds of years when nature was in abundance and we didn't have to think about it. But nature really is the primary infrastructure that we have. Without ecosystems we live in, without food production that depends on rain and actual biology, on genes and species, we really have nothing. And so it extends to coral reefs as well, and to natural infrastructure that island systems and that coral reefs provide. And until we really see that, and until we really capitalize on that and really build on those primary assets as the most important assets we have, more important than financial assets, we will continue to destroy them, I suppose. And I think really getting to that point of really planning with nature as the primary asset. So conservation isn't about just protecting biodiversity. It's really about building the natural asset base that we need and nature needs to survive and to regenerate and to be vibrant into the future. That's the essential role of conservation now, particularly on the planet that we have now.
Would any of the other panelists like to? Yes, Professor Callum.
If I can just add to what David says. In the past, of course, people used coral reefs as natural harbors and breakwaters. And so they would use the channels that were naturally available. They would build their villages close to those, for example. They would use ring reefs and basins as places where they could anchor their boats that they would be protected. But of course, concrete harbors offer a certain convenience. You can put them where you want them, but that means potentially destroying a lot of the natural protection too. And so you can cause a lot of problems by placing them in the wrong orientation, building them out over habitats and causing problems to circulation. We've seen that in many instances in the Maldives that these sorts of developments are causing fresh problems that didn't exist before they were put in place. And so it would be a really good thing to try and find ways of harnessing nature, perhaps as a bigger part of the solution to the needs of people for safe places for their boats and access to shore facilities and so on. And that isn't yet a very well developed area of reef science. It's certainly one that needs to be a lot more proactive in searching for solutions that other countries are using right now. Places like Holland, for example, are using salt marshes, sand dunes, and beach renourishment to act as their primary defenses against sea level rise. There isn't a comparable kind of soft engineering approach using coral directly. It's being developed around mangroves, for example, but I think there is equivalent research that needs to be done to try and find whether there are similar solutions possible.
Thank you. Now, can we assist evolution? Are we willing to, I think, to be honest, we are talking about genetic engineering. Are we willing to find a more resilient species that would survive climate change or that would thrive after climate change? Are we willing to find a biology, a biodiversity that would survive or that would be there at the end of the climate change? And are we willing to, as I keep saying, grow a harbor? Now, when we were younger, we used to cut hockey clubs from trees because the damn thing had grown like a club and you could really use it. Now, my point is, can you do that to coral? Can we find that basin, that harbor? Recently, just 2 weeks ago, an island called Rasheed, just a small island, it has a beautiful harbor inside its coral lagoon. But no, we didn't use that. We could have easily, for instance, done a bridge to that little, it's a short distance. But no, we didn't do that. The islanders wanted Boduhila Badar, they call it, which is rock boulder harbor. For some reason, we have sold these rock boulder harbors to our people, saying, okay, everyone should have one. But meanwhile, what the islander actually wants is calm waters, not necessarily rock boulders. They want a house, they want calm waters, and they want to save their beaches. My view is we must find alternative technology and science to do that. Hugging a tree is not going to save the forest. This is my very honest view is, no, we have to move.
I wonder if it's a problem with all of these, I mean, coral reefs essentially being underwater. Do we see this kind of engineering that President Rasheed is talking about with forests or other land-based ecosystems?
Well, of course, they're always planting and gardening. They're always gardening. And they're growing trees in all sorts of ways, where you could use it as a hedge, where you could use it as a maze, as shade, or whatever you want it done. Or they're using it to just cut it down. So you can have a 6-inch, 2-inch plank.
Shall I try and answer that very difficult question? And I think it's a complicated question. I think there are many scientists doing research on exactly what you mentioned, is trying to find the stronger corals, trying to either find them in nature in places where temperature stresses are very high and then breeding those out. And this is what agriculture and livestock farming has done for millennia, of course, in developing different breeds. And then there are laboratory-based experiments in trying to get resistant genes from those corals into other coral species. So I believe that yes, we will find more and we will develop more resistant coral species. We don't know what the limits of that resistance will be. Will it be enough to cope with the amount of warming that we're going to face in the coming decades? But the bigger question is that how many species will that affect? And so whereas in the Maldives you may have, and sorry, I don't know the exact numbers, you may have 350 species of corals in the source pool for the archipelago. With that sort of research and engineering of more resistant species, you might end up with 10 or 15 or 20. And the fact is that that number of species won't provide the complex functions that the 350 coral species do now. And this was, Callum mentioned that in his presentation. It's a difference between whether you can get those weedy species that can bounce back from anything, or you get those long-lived species that create the structure of the reef that give you that protection for a safe harbor. And they take hundreds of years to grow, and it takes, you know, more than hundreds of years for the reef framework to build up in the place that you want it, especially if you've destroyed it already through other activities. So these are really tough questions. I think we must try as hard as we can, and research must always push the barriers within ethical boundaries, but we have to learn to protect what we have, because we're losing it so fast that there's no way that artificial means can keep up with the loss of natural function and biodiversity that we're pushing right now. So we really have to reverse those pressures and stop the decline. I think that's critical for carbon dioxide and climate. That's critical for pollution and waste and the other pressures that we impose.
There's on this topic, there's a question from Azim Mustag. He's asking, how would having some steel frames with coral fragments help reef recovery in the long term?
So I don't want to monopolize the discussion on these sorts of things, but growing coral fragments is one of the techniques available in coral restoration and reef restoration techniques, and it's what you do in having a nursery of tree seedlings, for example. You grow out the young individuals in a safe space on those frames, and then you plant them out into nature and to a space. The constraint we have with coral reefs is that our physical ability to move around thousands of fragments of corals back out onto a natural reef system is extremely limited. And so while we do need research on those steel frames, we can use them on small reef systems that are very high value, such as to a village or to a resort. But we can't yet do that on the scale that will protect a harbor, for example, or rebuild a reef system around an island to protect it from waves. So these are big questions and needs long-term work.
Just to add to what David has said, there was a recent analysis of all the coral restoration efforts around the world, which, you know, really surprised me, that the total area restored was something like 70 hectares, and that's less than 1 square kilometer of reef from 284,000 square kilometers of reef worldwide. So it's really not a solution that we're able to scale up to the scale of the challenge at the moment, and it's incredibly expensive. So I think the sorts of nature-based solutions which David alluded to earlier, I think are the really important ones, whereby you're, and Kathryn as well, whereby you're taking away as many of the impacts that we know adversely affect corals as possible, and we're giving them the best chance to thrive into the future, even knowing that the conditions that are being driven in the wrong direction by climate change and greenhouse gases. So I think we can give coral reefs a better future by implementing large-scale protection, which is really it matches the scale of the problem much more, and that's why people are talking about the need to protect 30% of the sea from exploitation and other sources of mitigable harm. And if we could do that, then we would start really making a big inroad into getting coral reefs into a fighting fit condition to do the best they can as we struggle as a global society to address greenhouse gas emissions and climate change.
Shaha and Kathryn, would you like to add something? Any thoughts?
I think David and Callum had provided like the perfect answers to these questions. Some of these are really difficult to give a straight answer, but we know that as Callum said, we need to facilitate the natural recovery and adaptation of coral reefs on a large scale. So that's something to consider as we continue these discussions.
Yeah, and I'm I'm not an expert on coral reef restoration, but I will say that I think that we're at a point globally where we need to be trying a lot of different solutions to figure out what is going to be effective. And in terms of thinking about, what corals will thrive the best, and looking at what's most resilient, there certainly are strains out there that may survive better. And one, understanding what those naturally occurring strains are is, I think, an important first step. Genetic engineering, I think, is something that is important to consider, but faces a lot more hurdles in terms of ensuring that what you're altering is going to be a positive enhancement and not something that's destructive, ultimately more destructive to the environment, right? So I think that it's important for us to look at all options at this point in time to figure out what the best solutions might be.
Great. We have about 5 more minutes of this webinar. If maybe each panelist can give some final thoughts about the way forward, and we've discussed it quite extensively. So maybe we'll start with Shah.
Thank you, Zaheena. Yeah, I'm looking forward to how these recommendations are translated into policy and implemented across the Maldives. I think as we continue these discussions, we need to keep in mind that already global temperatures have raised 1.39 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And the latest science shows that global heating and bleaching of corals may happen as often as annually. So climate change is not a rhetoric anymore. It's happening. We are experiencing it. So I hope we can continue with these discussions for a better Maldives. Yeah.
Georgia?
I think I just want to sort of leave it on just how development just needs to or should really try and avoid impacts where possible, and really see infrastructure sort of as an ecosystem more holistically, and really think about the connectivity of the linkages between coral reefs, seagrass and mangroves.
We have Abdulaziz Abdul Hakim who's raised his hand. So is there a question you wanted to ask? Let me see. Okay. While we wait for the question, maybe Dr. David, Kathryn, and then Callum can go in that order.
Thank you, Zaheena. So just last couple of statements, I'll come back to research and information just very quickly. I'd have elaborated more if we had the time in the discussion, but on dredging has come up and impacts of sand harvesting. And we've had an issue like that here in Kenya, which I've done some work on. And we did identify a technique to reduce, at least to take the overflow from dredging activities away from the reef edge. So we are publishing that, so it goes into the literature so people can find it and react to that, because Georgia mentioned that in her presentation. I'm happy to discuss that offline or by email with any who are interested. And then as the chair of the Coral Specialist Group, so we are trying to push forward providing indicators that are increasingly useful for management and for decision-making and policies. So one is the Red List of Coral Species, which is a global assessment, which we're working on right now and completing hopefully in a year's time to update the status of corals. And the second is the red list of ecosystems focused on coral reefs. And we've just applied this in the Western Indian Ocean. And once it's in review, and that would may be a very useful tool in the Maldives to apply that. And we certainly want to project this globally. So hopefully we can collaborate with some of you in setting that up and helping to inform future policies. Thank you.
So I'll just quickly add that, well, first of all, thank you all for hosting, to the Maldives Coral Institute for hosting this discussion. It's been great to participate in it. And I think that as we look forward to a future, we'll globally be looking to the Maldives and their leadership. And at the end of the day, it's going to take political leaders to undertake and pass the policies that we need to ensure the long-term survivability of the planet. So I hope that you, President Rasheed, are at the forefront of that movement, and also your colleagues in the Maldives who have taken quite a bit of action to try to ensure the long-term sustainability of the ocean. But we have a long way to go, so I'm looking forward to seeing that happen and having the Maldives at the forefront of it.
I think what the present era is most characterized by is the rapidity of change and how far-reaching those changes are. And in the past, in the Maldives, there was so much in the way of plentiful, vigorous, highly productive, diverse marine resources that nobody needed to worry about the tomorrow or the future, because it was inconceivable that there would ever be insufficient of those resources to support the livelihoods of the people. I think today we see that that is no longer a tenable position. There is a very limited amount of marine resource to build upon. That resource is dwindling as well as human stresses build up and gradually degrade and erode its productive capacity. And I think we now are at the crossroads where we urgently need to rise to the challenge of finding ways to protect these vital assets. And that really is what the Maldives Coral Institute is all about and was founded for by President Rasheed. It's to think about the future, to consciously engage society with the problems that coral reefs face, and to find solutions together which are going to protect both the reefs and everyone who depends upon them.
Thank you. There are still a few more questions from the audience. We will get answers to them from the panelists, but we're out of time now. So I'd like to thank everybody for this really wonderful discussion. I'm quite struck by how this seems to be a field where there just hasn't been much thought or much research going into it. So obviously it's incredible that we've been able to come together and talk about it, and it's so, I mean, evident that there needs to be more of this. So thank you for everyone who's participated today, and to all of our panelists from all across the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, the panelists, Zaheena, and a huge amount of people who joined us. Thank you. Please keep your interest. I would again talk about science assisting to enhance evolution. I would continue to, I think, talk about this. Malthus, you would remember, talked about food production, or rather population. And then a few years later, we had the Green Revolution. It was genetic engineering, and that fed the world in a sense. We must conserve, I have no doubt about that, but we must also understand that we cannot be fighting a losing battle. The battle might already have been lost. So we really need to come out from our shells, from our inhibitions on what we can do to nature, Yes, we must be very careful about eating anything, but we must do what is necessary. But we must do it with enough science behind it and enough morality behind it. Thank you, and thank you very much. We will continue. I'm so sad that we couldn't, otherwise, Callum, this would have been the music time. It's almost sunset, and we could have done so much the better. I am so sorry. This is not the usual Coral Institute. The Coral Institute is a far more lively place. We've had our first Coral Festival, and we will soon have another Coral Festival. There is a beautiful island a gentleman has provided us to do exactly that. Again, thank you so much for the panelists and everyone taking part. And Aya and Paul, thank you ever so much for getting the show going. Thank you and bye.